In 31 BC, at the Battle of Actium, the fate of Rome was decided. Octavian, soon to be called Augustus, faced the combined forces of Mark Antony and Cleopatra. It was a battle cloaked in scandal. Antony, once Caesar's right-hand man, had aligned himself with the Egyptian queen, alienating Roman sensibilities and inciting Octavian's carefully crafted propaganda machine. It was a total victory. Within a year, both Antony and Cleopatra were dead, either by suicide or, some whispered, by the quiet engineering of Octavian's operatives. Egypt was turned into a Roman province, not a senatorial one, but a private possession of Octavian himself. As Tacitus would later write in his Annals, all the power of the state had been transferred to one man. This is usually the end of the story. Octavian wins, becomes Augustus, and reigns supreme in Rome. But of course, the game of Rome was not over. The rules had changed, the players were new ones, but Augustus' Rome is a beast that needs to be studied if one wants to understand why Europe remained so attached to the Roman Empire. Because if one looks at the history of Europe as a grand narrative, this is the true beginning. Everything that happened before was the introduction. So let's get into it. Octavian faced a paradox. He had crushed all rivals and held total command of the army, the treasury, and public opinion even. Yet, the Roman people still bore a centuries-old hatred for kingship. The very idea of a monarch had been poisonous ever since the expulsion of Tarquin the Proud in 509 BC. Julius Caesar's assassination was justified as a necessary act to preserve the Republic from tyranny. The dagger still cast a long shadow against anyone who wanted to wear a crown. And so, Octavian needed a solution to this puzzle. Luckily, he had one. His genius was not in conquering Rome, but in convincing Rome that he had not. He returned to the city in a victory procession, not as a dictator, but as a savior of order and tradition. The Senate and people of Rome lavished honors upon him. But crucially, he framed every move as a reluctant acceptance of duty. He declared himself the restorer of the Republic. I transferred the Republic from my power to the control of the Senate and the Roman people, he would later claim in the Res Geste, his kind of autobiography. This was of course a lie, and it wasn't. In 27 BC, he officially handed back extraordinary powers to the Senate in a symbolic gesture. The Senate, in turn, granted him a new title, Augustus. This was not merely a name, but a concept. It evoked sacredness, a divine aura, the approval of the gods. As Cassius Dio recounts, the name Augustus was chosen so that he might be revered more than feared. The same year, he was granted imperium over most strategically vital provinces, meaning those with legions. He also, as we said, secured the control of Egypt, a province whose wealth alone gave him leverage over the Senate. In theory, power was being shared. In practice, it had been concentrated, invisibly and irrevocably. The outer forms of the Republic remained. Consuls were being elected, senators were rising, magistrates were doing their job, but most elections were predetermined. As he was bestowed more and more roles, Augustus would often accept reluctantly, and even waited to be begged by the Senate or the people. It was political theater, but the audience was eager to believe. In the Aeneid by Virgil, written during this time and supported by Augustus' inner circle, this kind of mythos is central. The ghost of Achilles tells Aeneas in the book, "Your task, Roman, and do not forget it, is to rule the nations with your power, to impose the habit of peace, to spare the conquered and subdue the proud." The message was very clear. Rome's empire, and Augustus' control, was the will of fate. In Tacitus' words, they gave the title of Princeps to Augustus, and by that name all power was veiled. But what was the Princeps? It wasn't a king, nor a dictator, just first citizen. The title was carefully chosen, Princeps Senatus, an old republican title dating back to the 3rd century BC. The title had always referred to the most senior member of the Senate. It carried no formal executive power, but under Augustus it became a cloak for autocracy. He positioned himself as first among equals, a concept that would carry on into medieval Europe. But in truth, no one was equal to Augustus. He held auctoritas above all others. The intangible weight of moral superiority and command was not codified like Imperium, but it shaped every decision. Augustus' military control was veiled behind legal fig leaves. He held proconsular imperium maius, or greater proconsular power, meaning his command superseded all other governors. No one could outvote him. This kind of power was legally only applicable to the provinces, but later it extended to Rome itself, ensuring Augustus could intervene anywhere. In 23 BC came what is today known as the Second Settlement, with the first one being the relinquishing of power that we have already talked about. The Second Settlement came after a brief health scare that nearly killed Augustus. This moment terrified Rome. The fear of instability and the potential power vacuum pushed the Senate to grant him tribunitia potestas, the power of a tribune of the plebs. This meant that Octavian, or Augustus, could propose laws, veto decisions, and more importantly, act as the protector of the Roman people. It also tied him to the memory of the Gracchi, tribunes who had championed the poor. His image blended nobility with populism. Again and again, he was offered dictatorship over Rome. He refused. He was offered to be permanent consul. He refused. Leaving the consul chair open for elections was a genius idea because it gave the Senate a space in which they could fight for supremacy between each other without truly confronting Augustus. One could still become consul, the highest possible achievement in Rome, and then quietly allow Augustus to keep ruling. Cassius Dio notes that after these reforms, he did not take any office inconsistent with the laws or the customs of the ancestors, but he managed everything in accordance with them. Dio here is being ironic. Augustus appeared to obey tradition, but in reality he hollowed it out. This strategy continued in his public imagery. He dressed in modest toga rather than royal robes. He walked through the streets unguarded. He called the Senate to session, listened to debates, and made sure that his decrees were proposed by others. In the Res Geste, Augustus claims, "I excelled all in influence, auctoritas, but I had no more power, potestas, than others who were my colleagues." Pure illusion, but an illusion that worked. Now, Octavian might have held the reins of Rome, but no man, not even a princeps, could rule an empire alone. The story of Octavian is a story told in groups of 3. The Second Triumvirate, the first organization that wasn't part of the Roman system to actually control Rome legally, was of course composed by 3 people, Antony, Lepidus, and Octavian. And while the men were controlling and fighting, 3 women were acting right alongside them. Octavia, sister of Octavian, Livia, wife of Octavian, and Cleopatra. So finally, we get to the final and third group of 3. Destiny is weird that way. 3 groups of 3. Because in our little metaphor, Octavian isn't Augustus. Augustus is an entity of his own, formed by 3 people. We've already talked this a lot during the previous episodes. The Roman dragon has 3 heads, and during Octavian's reign, the 3 heads took center stage. We will skip over Octavian since, well, we know him pretty well, and move on to Marcus Agrippa. He was Octavian's oldest and most loyal ally, and after the Battle of Actium, which he personally won since he was the sword of Augustus, he didn't stop his work to improve the Roman Empire. While he was an innovator in naval warfare, introducing new technological systems and strategies, such as the use of the harpax, a grappling device, he was also one of Rome's greatest urban developer. During Augustus' rise, Rome was still a city of unpaved roads, tenements, and fire traps. Agrippa, as aedile in 33 BC, undertook massive infrastructure campaigns. He repaired aqueducts, built new cisterns, cleaned the sewers, and commissioned hundreds of public fountains. Lavish public baths were added to the city landscape, and the original Pantheon, the structure that stood there before the one we know today. In the Res Geste, Augustus boasts, "I built the Forum of Augustus, the temple of Mars Ultor." But many of these projects were in truth Agrippa's work, or founded from his own fortune. Agrippa functioned as Augustus' executor. He implemented the vision, kept the peace, and made it appear as if the city itself was rising up from the ground to embrace the Princeps in love. Politically, Agrippa played a delicate role. Though he had the respect of the army and the people, he never posed a threat, and that was an art. Augustus trusted him to hold temporary consulship, command provinces, and even act as second in command when Augustus fell ill. In 23 BC, when Augustus nearly died, there were rumors that he handed his signet ring to Agrippa rather than any senator or blood relative. Agrippa's marriage to Julia, Augustus' daughter, cemented his role in the imperial family. They had several children, Gaius, Lucius, and Agrippina the Elder, who would be drawn into the blood-soaked web of imperial succession. Agrippa became more than a friend. He became a founding patriarch of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. He died in 12 BC at the age of 51, likely from illness. He was the arm and the sword of Augustus, capable of holding immense power without ever becoming a threat. Perfect balance, as no other triumvirate ever could. But if Agrippa was Augustus' right hand, then Maecenas was his heart, his lips, and his tongue. Differently from Agrippa, he held no formal power, but his influence was immense. He never sought office. Instead, he operated in the quiet corridors of the Domus, managing foreign diplomacy, domestic policy, and above all, propaganda. Tacitus later alludes to Maecenas as one of the architects of the Principate ideological structure. Maecenas understood the power of narrative. He surrounded himself with poets, artists, and thinkers who could recast Augustus not as a victor in a civil war, but the savior of Rome. Through him, Augustus became not a tyrant but a second Romulus. He patronized Virgil, whose Aeneid created a new mythical origin for Rome, completely linked to Augustus. In Book 1, after all, Jupiter prophesies that from this noble line shall be born a Trojan Caesar who will extend his empire to the ocean and his glory to the stars. Horace, another of Maecenas' circle, was more subtle. His odes blend personal reflection with civic duty. In his work, he laments moral decline and urges a return to traditional Roman value, exactly the message Augustus needed the population to embrace. Even Propertius, whose poetry was erotic and personal, found ways to embed imperial imagery in his writing. "Let Caesar be a god, and let him have his temple among us." Maecenas shaped public perception more effectively than any law. Through him, Augustus became not just a man, but a myth. He retired from public life in 16 BC, possibly due to declining health, or more personal reasons, a disillusionment, if you will. So, if Augustus has 3 heads, who stands beside him? That would be Livia Drusilla, married to Augustus in 38 BC. Now, we have already talked about the weird situations with children in the last episode, so I will summarize. She gave Augustus no sons, but maneuvered carefully to ensure her own son future, since she had a previous husband and a previous child, Tiberius. She understood better than anyone that the real game at the time was succession. No one could really stand up to Augustus, so the road to power was to be prepared for the moment he would be no more. Now, everything we know about Livia is very complex on a historiographical level. After all, spoiler alert, she won the succession game. And since the resulting reign wasn't necessarily popular, her figure in history has paid the price for it. She is often depicted as a spider, a poisoner, a killer, slaughtering Augustus' family one by one in order to get Tiberius on the throne. We'll talk about that in a second, but what we can say is that even if Livia wasn't the spider she was depicted as, she most certainly was a capable woman who kept a dense network of spies and alliances, deeply respected, extremely feared, and especially the model of a Roman woman. Chaste, dignified, loyal. It's weird how history can create two faces, right? The perfect woman and the spider. And yet, of course, it doesn't take a genius to understand that one can spun the web in whatever direction he chooses. She can be the perfect woman, or she can act as the perfect woman. So a spider, or not a spider. Now, as far as succession goes, Augustus' first experiment with dynastic succession came early. His sister Octavia's son, Marcellus, was young, promising, and beloved by the public. He was given early honors, allowed to hold office years before the legal age, and in 25 BC, Augustus married him to his daughter Julia, a transparent move to position him as heir. But naturally, Marcellus was young, untested, and may have lacked the political cunning needed to survive in the shadows of Augustus' older advisors. He died suddenly in 23 BC at just 19. The cause was officially illness, but ancient sources like Cassius Dio and Tacitus hint at tensions in the court. Livia, the spider, was whispered to have resented him, but there is no way to know what happened. Virgil, writing soon after, inserted a famous and deeply emotional passage into the Aeneid where Aeneas sees the spirit of Marcellus in the underworld. Anchises weeps, saying, "O child of pity, if only you could break your cruel fate," a public display of grief for the lost heir. With Marcellus gone, Augustus turned again to Agrippa, his old comrade. He gave him tribunician power, made him his military proxy, and crucially, married him to Julia, as we said, after Marcellus' death. This second marriage was entirely political. From this union came Gaius, born in 20 BC, and Lucius, born in 17 BC. Both of these child were adopted by Augustus as his own sons in 17 BC. Coins were minted in their name, statues were erected. The public was trained to recognize their faces. They were declared Princeps Juventutis, leaders of the youth, and given command appointments while still teenagers. Of course, we're talking ceremonial appointments. The boys were symbols, puppets moved around a chessboard of image and tradition. In reality, the empire was still Augustus to run. When Agrippa died in 12 BC, Augustus became sole ruler once more. Yet, the line of succession, now clear on paper, was anything but secured. Julia, mother of the imperial heirs, and Augustus, only child, became a liability. Despite being used as a dynastic pawn, she rebelled against the strict morality Augustus imposed on Rome. Her infidelities became public, then scandalous. In 2 BC, she was arrested and exiled for adultery and immorality. Tacitus frames this as political. Julia had formed her own faction. Removing her wasn't about virtue, it was about control. Two women, two factions, fighting for succession, were suddenly watching House of the Dragon. Augustus was devastated. The woman he had used to build his dynasty had humiliated him, and he now raised Gaius and Lucius alone. But fate struck again. Lucius died in 2 AD, on his way to the Spanish frontier. Gaius, wounded in Armenia, died in 4 AD of lingering injuries. Another 2 heirs, groomed for 2 decades, dead within 2 years. And this time, one would have to go deep into conspiracy to put these kills on Livia's head. With them gone, only one man remained. Only one who was young enough to guarantee stability and experienced enough not to, well, destroy the empire. Tiberius Claudius Nero, Livia's son by her first marriage. After all, Tiberius had served loyally, fought on the Rhine, in Pannonia and in Armenia, earning a reputation as a capable, if sullen, commander. He was no Agrippa, no genius of the battlefield, no charismatic heir. He was quiet, methodical, and painfully reluctant. Augustus never seemed to favor him. In fact, he had once forced Tiberius to divorce his beloved wife, Vipsania Agrippina, Agrippa's daughter, to marry the disgraced and widowed Julia. The marriage was a disaster. Tiberius resented it deeply and eventually exiled himself to Rhodes, claiming illness but likely retreating in despair. And yet, in 4 AD, Augustus had no more choices. He adopted Tiberius as his son, formally bringing him into the Julian line. At the same time, though, he adopted Agrippa Postumus, the third son of Julia and Agrippa, a brutish, violent youth with little political promise. A backup in case Tiberius failed, but not a realistic one. Now, considering the case that Livia didn't kill anyone to get Tiberius on the throne, you have to understand that it is realistic that people thought so. Tacitus, after all, describes Tiberius as dark and insincere. Suetonius calls him morose, secretive, and cruel. Whether these accounts are exaggerated by later scandals is uncertain, but even in his lifetime, he was seen as a poor replacement. As for Agrippa Postumus, he didn't last long. He was banished in 7 AD under murky charges. We still have some stuff to talk about before the succession, though. How did the republican institutions that the empire was wearing, like a skin mask, work? Formally, the Senate was retaining its authority. It deliberated, passed decrees, offered guidance to magistrates. But Augustus had already neutered it during the second settlement of 23 BC, when he assumed Imperium Maius Proconsulare, a power that outranked every governor in the empire. By that time, the Senate had lost its most important power, control over the provinces. Augustus took the provinces that had armies, as we said, Hispania, Gaul, Syria, Egypt, while leaving the most peaceful and impoverished ones, like Achaia and Macedonia, to senatorial control. Membership in the Senate was also curated. Augustus purged it twice, once in 28 BC and again in 18 BC, reducing it from over 900 people to a more manageable 600. The Senate became a club of loyalists, made up of men whose wealth, titles, or survival often depended on the favor of the Princeps. Suetonius tells us that during his reign, Augustus never openly overrode the Senate. Instead, he advised, and his recommendations were always adopted. After 23 BC, Augustus held no official role in the Roman government. Yet, he ruled with more authority than any consul before him. As Princeps, he was simply the first to speak, the first to be obeyed, the man whose absence stalled legislation and whose approval was the air everyone breathed. But if the institutions in Rome still looked republican, the army no longer did. Under the Republic, Rome's military had been a citizen army, conscripts raised in times of war, then discharged. After the Marian reforms, in the late 2nd century BC, the legions had begun to professionalize, but it was Augustus who finalized this transformation. He created a standing army, fixed in number, 28 legions, later fluctuating a little bit, stationed throughout the provinces. Service became a 20-year career, with fixed pay, equipment, and specific retirement benefits, not like the times where Pompey had to fight to get his men land. In order to do this, Augustus created the Aerarium Militare in 6 AD, a military treasury founded by new taxes, including a 5% inheritance tax and a 1% sales tax. This fund ensured veterans received land grants or cash payments upon retirement. not from the general as it was before, but from the state itself. So Augustus had the elite and he had the army, but it wasn't enough. The people remained. The Roman populace, long accustomed to civil war, famine and instability, needed reassurance. So he gave them what they wanted: peace, food and spectacle. The grain dole, annona, was systematized. Though this was started during the Republic, Augustus expanded its distribution and tied the food supply deeply to imperial benevolence. Hundreds of thousands of Romans received monthly grain rations. Other than this and the architectural work of Agrippa himself, he also provided games. Gladiatorial contests, chariot races, and theatrical performance became imperial gifts. Augustus often presided in person, something many other emperors will do after him, practically all of them, because, after all, this kind of fun, this kind of prosperity, only comes from the emperor. And as a father, he needs to sit at the head of the table. And here we enter one of Augustus' most ambitious programs, the moral reformation of Roman society. To do so, he passed a series of laws, the Lex Julia de Maritandi Ordinibus, the Lex Papia Poppaea, all created to regulate marriage, adultery, and procreation. These laws rewarded Roman citizens for marrying and having children, especially among the upper classes. Penalties were imposed on those unmarried or childless. Adultery, previously a private matter, became a public crime, punishable by exile and confiscation of property. Now, these laws were not really in the Roman ethos. The Romans did value virtue, but privately they were far more liberal. Even Augustus' own daughter, Julia, was persecuted under these laws. Exiled for adultery in 2 BC, some saw this as hypocrisy, others saw this as proof that the laws applied even to the imperial family. The goal was twofold: to promote a return to traditional Roman values and to reinforce Augustus as moral compass of the state. He was not just a ruler, he was the architect of virtue. But enforcement was inconsistent. The elite resented interference in their private affairs. Marriages became strategic and performative. Children were raised for census numbers. This was the part of Augustus' project that never really worked. But even with this failure under his belt, Augustus had changed Rome deeply. He lived long enough to see the world he'd remade fully stabilized in his image. By the year 14 AD, he was 75 years old. His health was in decline, his trusted circle had grown smaller, and Rome had grown quiet, almost unnaturally so. For the first time in memory, there was no civil war at the horizon, no revolutions waiting to happen, no upheaval. The man who had once been a teenage claimant in a broken world was now the living embodiment of Roman permanence. His deification was completely assured. Already people were worshipping him, and while he didn't want to be worshipped, he wanted it for later because, well, that would give his dynasty exactly what Caesar gave him: to be the inheritors of the legacy of a god. In his final years, Augustus increasingly withdrew from public life. He spent much of his time in the Campania region, near Naples, especially at his villa in Nola, not far from where his father had died decades earlier. Suetonius records that Augustus remained lucid to the end. He concerned himself with logistics, had time with his close family, and even joked about his death. His last words to the gathered friends and attendants, according to the more theatrical tradition, were, "Have I played my part well in the comedy of life? Then applaud as I exit." Yet Suetonius also records a simpler, more intimate version. Words spoken to Livia as he died in her arms. "Livia, live mindful of our union. Farewell." And so came the time of Tiberius. He was hesitant, according to Tacitus, even restrained. He shed tears, groaned, called himself unworthy, and yet he failed to reject the empire. The Senate, knowing the performance was a ritual, played their part, urging him to accept. They pretended to doubt whether he truly wanted a dance, a tradition of forced reluctance that Augustus had started. But Tiberius was most probably actually reluctant. He had been trained to rule but never learned to inspire. The early years of his reign were marked by uncertainty. Was he truly the emperor? Was the republic still alive? Was Livia, his mother, the actual emperor? With the death of Augustus, the imperial cult became large, extremely important, so powerful that Tiberius himself had to stop it from being a little too forward in worshipping him immediately. After all, in 15 AD, the Senate proposed building a temple to Tiberius and Livia. He declined. Cassius Dio says Tiberius claimed that only gods dead and deified officially should receive temples. In the end, Augustus won the greatest political gamble in Roman history, using contradictions, using illusions. He created a monarchy while claiming to preserve a republic. He killed his way to power, then ruled with absolute restraint. He died as a mortal and rose as a god. But his greatest achievement was that after death, he made people forget the difference. He killed the contradiction. Rome had no constitutional mechanism for monarchy, no divine right. It had only the inertia of memory. And Augustus gave that memory form, weight, ritual, and permanence. The empire would fracture, reform, and eventually, in the end, fall. But in every generation of emperors, from Trajan to Diocletian, from Constantine to Justinian, there would be one unshakable question in the heart of each of them. How do you measure up to Augustus?